Welcome to the TrueWorks podcast, the podcast that helps you understand how the gospel transforms your life and your work. I'm your host, Joshua Smith, and with me is my guest, Doug Meikle. Doug, welcome guest to my show.
Yeah, it's, wow. It's just such an honor to be here to share this podium with you. It's just, wow. I don't know. It's all downhill from here. It's all downhill from here.
Yeah, when you're at the top, it's lonely and it's downhill.
Yep.
On our podcast today, we are talking about a pretty influential figure to TrueWorks. He provides somewhat a model to what we are trying to do as an organization, and that is the 19th century figure, Abraham Kuyper. Now, if we had a patron saint of our organization and of the faith work intensive class, it would certainly be Augustine. But if we had some type of practitioner of our patron that follows the principles and ideals of our patron saint, I think it would have to be Abraham Kuyper.
Yeah, well,
he'd be in the running.
For sure he'd be in the running, yeah. And I guess much of the intellectual background to this entire faith and work intensive comes out of Kuyper's work. And so Kuyper's for folks who are not familiar, Dutchman, and come from the Dutch Reformed tradition, Calvinist in his, and we'll get to more of what that might mean in a moment, but Calvinist in his tradition also. But a pretty remarkable man, Dutch thinker, theologian, became prime minister. He founded a party. He founded a political party, became prime minister of India. He started a university, the Free University of Amsterdam. Was founded by him.
This is just incredible to me. Yeah.
Also founded a newspaper. And I can't remember exactly the name of it, but Dutch newspaper founded it. And these were institutions founded because of how he saw the world and how he felt he was called to act within the world as a Christian. And we ask you in the Faith and Work Intensive to read one or two, certainly one of his rather famous in theological circles lectures on Calvinism. And those lectures were given in Princeton at the end of the 19th century, where he was invited to give one of these theological talks, and he gave 6 lectures. And again, we're gonna ask you to read one, but they're all very much worth a read, and quite a challenge to the modern reader in a lot of ways.
And one of those challenges stems from the title.
Yes.
So the title of the lectures, he calls them the Lectures on Calvinism. Now, to kind of, if we zoom out, if from the church world, or I guess from the Protestant evangelical North American church world, if we zoom out, if people know about Calvinism,
what do they know?
Well, but this is how I received it in my education. It's something like they know about the Protestant work ethic that's associated with Calvinism, and they know about this deterministic predestination God.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And that's basically it.
Yeah.
Now, when you zoom in to the church world, Calvinism has other connotations. It's typically an idea that's brought up when we talk about how people are saved in free will and Arminianism versus Calvinism. And we're not going to say any more about that because that's not at all what the lectures on Calvinism are about.
Yes.
And Kuyper knows this when remember, he's talking to a Princeton audience. So he's talking to a century ago, an American audience. And he takes his whole first lecture to define exactly what he means by Calvinism. And that's what we're going to talk about first so that we can understand the nature and the scope of this system.
I think a couple of things about this. I think, first of all, the Calvinism as it's popularly passed down to us, I think doesn't do Calvin a whole lot of justice. And I think that's something...
Oh, yeah, the namesake. I guess we should...
Yeah, so,
start
well, I think it's fair to say that that's one of the things that gives... The reason why Kuyper can speak of Calvinism as he does is because he knows his Calvin, right? And he knows what Calvin was about, and doesn't think of Calvin through these kind of caricature-like lenses. So, for example, I think if you were going to describe the work of Calvin, the man, I think you could kind of put it into two broad categories, in my view. And I'm not a scholar; I'm just a reader.
You're Dougie Fresh.
Yes, that too. But anyway, so Calvin had really kind of two great things in his life. One was the writing of this book called the Calvin's Institutes, the book that he wrote the first edition to that in 1536, I think, if I remember correctly. Yeah, 1536 edition, and he was born in 1509. So he wrote this first edition of this great work when he was a relatively young man, and wrote it as a companion to the scriptures, that folks could read his book and read the scriptures and be enlightened. And that book, that great kind of work of theology that went through his whole life, it was revised multiple times through his life. And the edition, if you buy it today, I think you will generally get the 1559 edition. There was one or two after it, I think, in translation that were made, but that was the kind of final one that Calvin worked on, if I remember right.
Greatly expanded, right?
Greatly expanded, but not in modern terms a particularly large book. Certainly something you could get through. You'd have to do a bit of reading, but you can get through it. And Calvin's great work there begins famously with the quotation that all knowledge is essentially divided into two parts: the knowledge of God and the knowledge of self. And those two poles, if you like, we must work on together. That as we know ourselves, it reveals God to us. As we know God, it reveals us to us. And what's the primary one there? He interestingly says at the end of that little quote, it's hard to say. That we do these things together, and the book itself is kind of an outworking of that. So the fact that there's stuff in there about predestination or whatever is not a primary objective for Calvin. The book is written to help people get to know themselves and to get to know God, at least in my view, at least. But if that's one pole, if you like, the other great pole of Calvin is Geneva, the city, and Calvin spent a great deal of his time as part of the city council in Geneva and worked hard to make it a place that was fit to live in and also a fit sanctuary for refugees. There are many refugees in Geneva in his day, mostly from France, mostly under persecution of the Catholic kings there, kings and queens. So that was other great work, the city itself. So for Calvin, the work of the kind of the theologian, the public theologian, is to do all this preaching and teaching and theological writing, but it's also very practical, a kind of deeply practical thing that it would be manifest itself in how we run our cities and how we give resources to the disenfranchised and how we create a home for the folks that are running away from persecution. These are all certainly core parts of kind of Calvin and his life. It was very much an integrated life. So when you hear of that Calvin, then it makes a lot more sense that when you actually start to listen to Kuyper about how he talks about Calvinism, because for him, Calvinism is this wonderful system of all-encompassing,
right?
Something that encompasses the entire world. Everything is caught up in it. Why? Because it's this system of thought and practice and life that leads to our flourishing. And specifically in these lectures, he talks about several elements of that, like art and art and also politics, science, the church. Yeah. That's how we see the flourishing of this relationship between man and God happen in these areas of life. Yeah.
And the thing that's animating Kuyper, and this makes him, in many ways, even though he's a century old, a contemporary, is this problem that he is faced with, that the church is faced with. How will the church respond to and live faithfully in the modern world. So this is not a history lesson, but the way that the church relates to the world in the modern era, which is, say, post-Renaissance, is quite different than how it relates to the world prior to it. And Kuyper doesn't want to be in any way, like a Mennonite or an Amish where, the church had its heyday in this kind of historic time and we need to return to that historic time. He's saying, no, God is still with us. God is sovereign, and this is the moment of time that we find ourselves. So how then shall we live as faithful Christians in the modern world? And in the text, he goes through several offerings, and we're not going to talk about all of those offerings, but what he's trying to show is that the approach to that the church has, specifically the church informed by this Augustinian Calvinistic tradition, is the best way for not only the church to thrive, but for society at large to thrive.
Yeah.
That second point, that the best way for society at large to thrive, it's hard to emphasize how big of a claim that is and how ambitious of a claim that is. I don't think any less ambitious in his own time as it is in our own.
Oh, no, not at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm glad you put it like that, because I think that's a great way of thinking about it, that for him, this thing he calls Calvinism, this way of thinking and being and living in the world that's created by God and sustained by God, is this complete and total claim, on everything, on all. And there's subtleties to that we're going to talk about in a moment, very profound subtleties to it in its own way. But first of all, just the scope. There's no corner. In fact, this is one of the famous quotes, of course.
Yes,
there's not I'm paraphrasing, but it's like there's not a square inch of your life over which Jesus does not say, that is mine. And that's really what he tries to work out. He works as if that's true, as if he works as if that's the very nature of things. There is no place in our world and in our life where Jesus does not say, that is mine. And he tries to work all that out. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's as if Kuyper's saying, Jesus is not Lord only of my soul. He's Lord of the world, of the cosmos, right? So when I go into, all of these activities that he was involved in, certainly he was a theologian, a thinker, writer, but a journalist, a prime minister, started a university. He went into that saying, this is Jesus's newspaper.
Yeah.
This is Jesus's university. And when we hear that phrase, this is the Lord's, we may instantly have, thoughts of, an explicitly Christian university or explicitly Christian newspaper, but that's not exactly how Kuyper thought of it.
Well, I think
in so many words.
In so many words, right? Because I think he would probably see this as an explicitly Christian newspaper venture. It's just not constructed the way that we would typically associate with it today, right?
Yeah. Good.
So if we say something like an explicitly Christian university, we might think of something, I don't know, Liberty or something like that, Liberty University or something like that, yeah? That's not what Kuyper is thinking about at all. In fact, that's the subtlety and the profundity of his way of seeing the world, that an insight that we take to heart here is that each of these areas of life have their own so-called sphere, within which they have their own kind of governing structure and authority beneath God. So it's not like the Christian university is underneath the church, for example. The Christian university in the world is alongside the church, and the church doesn't have the right to, if you like, speak into and with authority and cause to bend the knee of the institution of the university. No, there's only one power to which the university bends the knee, and that is to Jesus himself. So therefore, the church, or excuse me, the university, that's his whole point of the Free University of Amsterdam, would be a university free from the influence of others, including the church, that it might be free to pursue its mission before God. Yeah, it's a kind of a profound way of seeing the world. Yeah.
Well, profoundly Protestant.
Yes, true.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
So it's certainly rooted, and that's why he talks about this is not lectures on Augustinianism, because obviously there's a strong Augustinian thread, but Augustine could not say that last part.
Well,
where,
that's right,
yeah.
and I think that also explains, and sometimes we get pushback from our faith and work intensive folks about how he talks, for example, what he called Romanism, the Roman Catholic. It's that their view would be that the church would sit above for example, in our university example, the church would sit above the university, and the university would pay homage, if you like, to the hierarchy of the church. Again, profoundly Protestant, but for Kuyper, the institution of the university is different, separate, and seeks its own destiny before God. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so you use this phrase that for Kuyper is a technical phrase, sphere sovereignty or sphere of influence.
Yeah.
So let's unpack that just a bit more. So what Kuyper means by that is that the rules of engagement, the rules for success, the rules and critique of different spheres are that they play by different rule books. And so when art critics and artists are creating and critiquing art, the ones who have privy to that kind of expertise is none other than the quote-unquote art world.
Yeah.
And that the church, the magisterium, cannot then come over the art world and over that sphere and speak into it because it lacks that expertise. And this is different than a view that thinks that the church itself as an entity has some direct connection between it and God and can speak into the art world authoritatively, even more than, say, the art critics and the artists themselves. So in that way, it's profoundly Calvinist because it has this, I don't want to use anti-magisterial, but non-magisterial, I guess I should say, sense. And in other ways, it is magisterial since his view of the church. But
so why did we ask you guys to read this? Because Kuyper has this profound sense that first of all the world is God's, and he's just not making that claim glibly. He tries to and asks us to whatever sphere of life we are in. If we, for example, have a job in law enforcement, his call to us would be to before God seek the purpose of law enforcement underneath the lordship of Jesus. Jesus is Lord over all, but the church can't tell you how to be a good law enforcement officer, but before God you can work that out. It's not so much for yourself, but you can work that out institutionally as how that profoundly important task of society.
Nothing less than for yourself, but
No, that's right. So that's not to say that it's not also for yourself, but that sense that kind of profound sense of calling happens before God, and that you as an individual, as a part of an institution, can work out that destiny before Jesus. And I think that's something that's very, we would seek to encourage you guys to think about the world in much the same way that some of you guys may work in various different fields like insurance or medicine or house building or whatever. And we would want to encourage you, and Kuyper kind of gives you some of the tools within which to seek what does it look like in your world to do that in a way that you can bring it under the lordship of Jesus. What would that actually look like? And I think that's a pretty profound question, I think, that he is laying before us. And
bringing it under the lordship of Jesus is going to be the best thing for that sphere, because that sphere is God created everything in the beginning, and he saw that all was good. And so in bringing it before the face of God is the best thing for its own flourishing.
Yeah, indeed.
And he begins to help us see how this can play out in different spheres. And I thought that we could look at what he talks about in art.
Okay.
Now, I am not an artist of the typically associated way, and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've got my Dougie Fresh persona.
You do.
Yeah.
Usually, I thought that was referring to nefarious activities.
Yeah, but also artful.
Okay,
Yeah.
Artfully
Nefarious. Yeah.
Okay. And he talks about that Calvinism in the way that he defined it, as we've been trying to paint for you in our episode, is the best thing for the art world. And so he begins his discussion about other types of philosophical or religious systems and how they deal with art. Now, when you look at the history of the world, it's no mystery that in the history of the world and the current world, that religion is this great inspiration for
art,
great
yeah.
art. Some of I am, I guess, kind of a bore in this way, and my favorite art is, well, we could just end it right there.
That's right.
Yeah.
You're a bore in that way. Yes.
Yes,
We
period.
Agree. We agree.
A bore in my taste in art. I just love realism, just so classical Renaissance kind of art. And of course, that is birthed out of various factors, but many of the themes and many of the commissions are done within the context of either adorning the church or literally on the church walls, like the Sistine Chapel. And he considers Hellenism, he considers Islam, so on and so forth. And then he turns to Calvinism, and he's like, and we don't have such a beautiful history. So how in the world is Calvinism as this kind of all-encompassing system helping art flourish to its utmost? And his basic point is that, well, it releases it to do what it needs to do. When you release the art world and it practices its endeavors and its pursuits before the face of God, then it can discover the full beauty and creativity that God originally intended it to. For example, he says the art that comes out of the Renaissance that's kind of quote unquote under the control of the church, that's beautiful art, but there's also beautiful art that's outside of that control.
Yeah.
And only Calvinism can kind of make sense of that in a way that God is still sovereign.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, but I think that we lived my wife and I and my kids, we lived in Holland for several years, and he's a Dutchman, of course. And so there's a Kuyperian tradition there, but much of the Renaissance art was indeed inspired by the church, right? And it is in places like the Sistine Chapel, etc. But you get to the Netherlands, and the art there, the art that is that's famous there is not so much in churches, but it's outside of the church. It's Rembrandt painting himself over the the decades of his life, understanding how he changed over time in a way that no one else had done before.
But Rembrandt's painting in a particular context, or I mean, like he's kind of afterwards, right?
Well, my point is that there's a change there with the Calvinism, that the sponsors of the art are not the church, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at someone like Vermeer, for example, the beauty of Vermeer's work is not in the pictures, say, of Christ, or his apostles or the Mother Mary or anything like that. Vermeer's work is about the girl with a pearl earring, or the detail that's applied to kind of human living and human existence.
Right.
His his vistas that he paints are just full of this vibrant life, and I think that's his point about art being set free, is that when it's in the church, it can be beautiful, but it's restricted in its commission, if you like. Whereas once it's released
full
from
potential.
the church, when it's released from the church, one starts to see developing all of these other things that is great art. The still life was not a thing until the Dutch Renaissance and Belgian Renaissance painters decided to take that up. So I think there is a way of looking at art. I think that the art is a good example of something here. And you can actually readily see how when the church almost releases art to its own devices, it's not that it comes back lesser. Oftentimes it can come back better, fuller, clearer,
Well, it's released to its own devices before the face of God.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, and I think you don't have to be any art critic or connoisseur to know that if it's released to its own devices not before the face of God, there's not good things that happen.
Well, indeed, and and certainly that is true. You shouldn't read these things of Kuyper as license, so to speak, as the ability to do whatever the heck you want, but you should read them. The same way as we went back to Augustine, is that, that phrase of love God and do what you like, that there's a sense of if you're ordering your loves well, the product of that is this immense freedom. And I think that's what he's trying to say about art as well, is that when we love God and order our loves well, the creative product of that is this wonderful thing shorn of its restrictions, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me I think that's right. That's the beauty of Kuyper, at least in my mind. And we hope you guys, as you look at this, will start to see some of that. He repays a careful reading, and in the course of doing the Faith and Work Intensive, we're also going to get someone in to talk specifically about Kuyper and knows a little bit about him. And then there's a couple of, hopefully, some video resources that will help you as well. But if there's a sort of intellectual scent of the work that we have done over these last, again, several podcasts and months that we've been doing the reading together, Kuyper is our guy. So take a careful read of this, and we really hope you'll enjoy it.
So I think that does it for our episode for today. Thank you for joining us on the TrueWorks podcast. If you'd like to hear other episodes of the TrueWorks podcast, you can find it on all podcasting platforms, or you can visit us on our website at trueworkshouston.org. Thank you so much, and see you next time.